where I'm from in the UK, people are having kids later. And people are buying houses later. People are getting married later. People are doing all of these things later. And a big part of the reason for that is just the cost of doing them is so high, and you have to reach a later stage of your career where you're both earning quite a lot before you can actually do it. A lot of people, I think, feel like the economy isn't working for them. I feel like the economy hasn't worked for the average person for a very long time. Place that I start is the 2008 financial crisis. Ever since then, I think things have been different. You could go back earlier, perhaps, but that's where I start because that's kind of in line with my experience. But since then, it's just felt like we've lurched from crisis to crisis. You know, we've had the financial crisis, we've had austerity in a lot of countries, we've had the housing crisis, climate, pandemic, cost of living. It's one thing after another, and people are really feeling the pinch. Housing costs are rising, inflation has been very high for the first time in a long time. Inflation was in double digits across the globe. And I try to identify what kind of factors have led to this. So each chapter of 8 chapters is an exploration of a particular characteristic of our economy that leads to people getting poorer, that leads to people, not being able to get by. An example of a chapter in the dysfunctional section of the book would be housing. Housing just hasn't worked for almost everyone. I live in London, and London's a lovely city. And people in London are relatively richer than people in the rest of the UK, certainly, and we have a lot of advantages. But the thing is, housing costs are just insane in London. The amount we pay for rent, for mortgages, or for buying a house is way, way above the rest of the country. So although London seems like it's richer, a lot of that is absorbed by housing. And I just think that seems to be the case across the board. So, with these things, kind of inequality or unevenness and kind of sucking all the money up to the top, and then dysfunctionality, kind of meaning that things don't work in general, this explains a lot of our current malaise. So this is chapter 6, which is about the money system. And I feel like this book's partly an economics explainer, right? I'm trying to explain how the economy works. But the thing is that every single issue that I explained during the writing process, I ended up concluding that it wasn't really working and that it was going wrong, which is hence the title, Why We're Getting Poorer, right? So with the money system, there's a lot of misconceptions about the money system, and I think you get them in economics textbooks. I think in popular perception, a lot of people probably just still think money is backed by gold. There are polls showing this. A lot of people do, and a lot of people also, even if they don't think it's backed by gold, they think of cash and coins. But the truth is that we live in a credit economy. The overwhelming majority of money is credit, right? And that goes for like the deposit that you have in your bank, all the way up to these high-flying financial instruments and, government bonds and CDOs, CDSs, all this type of stuff. They're all used as a type of money, and you can adopt different definitions of money depending on how restrictive you want to be. So what happens when banks create credit? Well, what they do is if they make a loan, to you, say, for a new business you want to start, what will happen is that you will suddenly have a deposit with the bank, right? So you have a deposit with the bank and you also have that loan, and vice versa. The deposit for you is an asset and the loan is a liability. You owe it to the bank. Vice versa for the bank. The deposit is actually a liability for them. They owe it to you, and the loan is an asset. So that kind of balances, right? There's this magic process of like through double entry bookkeeping, which, has been around for hundreds of years. This kind of balances, the books balance, and therefore, it's deemed legitimate by our financial system. Now, what happens is the government does have a role. We said that the government doesn't create all money. 97% in the UK, 97% of money is created through this credit creation process by private banks, but the government does have to accommodate it. Every country in the world, pretty much has a central bank that has issues its own currency, and they have a very close relationship with the banks. Banks can hold reserves at the central bank, and the best way of thinking of that is just like the central bank is like the bank of banks, right? So it's like just as you have a deposit at your bank, they have reserves at the central bank, and that license, you have to be granted a license to be able to do that. That license kind of facilitates this whole process because banks need reserves to back up all of their credit, because you need to be able to go there and say, I want to withdraw all my deposit in cash, right? And that's where the reserves come in. They need the reserves to kind of facilitate that on a day-to-day basis. If they don't, then that's when you get bank runs and bank collapses and stuff like that. So there's this whole system, right? It's like banks creating credit, but the government kind of backs them up with this reserve system, and they manage it primarily through interest rates. And I say the government, you can distinguish between the government and central bank, they're related, but most central banks are independent. So it's the central bank that facilitates this process, right? So they manage interest rates, they manage the number of reserves that they're buying and selling in financial markets, and that affects the interest rate, and that affects the terms on which banks can lend. And while this sounds very complicated, most people know this because when the interest rate goes up, your mortgage rate goes up, right? That is a really straightforward mechanism. Everybody knows that, right? I'm not saying this system is all bad, that it's all a conspiracy or anything, but what central banks were declared independent in the 90s for most countries, even more so since 2008, we've seen a move towards private debt. Because what's actually happening here, I think the problem with this is that basically the main mechanism through which central banks manage the economy is to try and squeeze households. We've seen this with when inflation went up, right? We had the cost of living crisis. Inflation was really high. Prices jumped, right? Now inflation's back down again. That's partly because central banks increased interest rates, and that takes demand out of the economy. It reduces inflation by squeezing households. But it's kind of perverse, isn't it? Because it's like we've got a cost of living crisis, so let's increase interest rates and therefore the cost of living and squeeze people more. It works at bringing down headline inflation, it does, but I say in the book it kind of solves the disease of inflation by killing the patient. A lot of people suffer during this process. And these interest rates, as well as fees and fines, where do they go? Right, they go to the banks, and I think that generally is one source of inequality. But they also, the people who have savings, who have more savings with banks, get the benefit of the interest rates on savings, right? And it goes to those people. Who are those people? Who has savings? Richer people, right? Richer people, really rich people can have millions in savings, and it might be, past a certain point, it's probably not a deposit in the bank. They might deposit it in, other financial instruments or even fine art or something. But this is like a transfer, right? This is a wealth transfer into the banks and to those people, from the borrowers to the savers, and the borrowers tend to be poorer. So I do think that there's a real issue with how we've chosen to structure monetary policy. We don't pay enough attention to private debt, and we don't pay attention to the ways that I think squeezing people with interest rates, generally speaking, is bad for inequality, because it affects the poor more. Globalization and trade deals have had a very complex effect on the world. I think that, being in South Korea, you're in a country that has benefited somewhat from this process as your tech sector has developed and become, Samsung and Hyundai, like that you have benefited. I think China has benefited as well. The other East Asian tigers, as they're sometimes called, and a bunch of other countries across the world. However, there are two problems as I see it. One, they're in rich countries. Trade deals have led to outsourcing, so that a lot of the communities that previously manufactured goods like cars and tech equipment, they've been kind of left behind. And you see the complete hollowing out of these communities. There's no employment, there's no opportunities. There's what people have taken to calling deaths of despair. So, there's some really serious consequences to this. Despite the countries being richer, the consequences are still life or death. So you've got that kind of outsourcing. But I also think that although globalization and trade deals as they stand, they're still kind of structured in a way that benefits the global rich, right? So there are a few ways that this happens. So partly they tend to reinforce intellectual property rights. The TRIPS agreement, for instance, extended intellectual property rights, like the length of them, copyright and patent laws, and those tend to be owned by the rich. Those rights, the global rich, right? There are companies that just buy up intellectual property rights for things they never created, and they just get the fees, very similar to what I was discussing with the financial system, right? It's just fees just flowing to the rich. So although there have been benefits to globalization, and I want to underscore that it's a very complex process, I do think that at the end of the day, and you can see this in the evidence on global inequality, the global middle class has done pretty well. The middle class is represented most accurately by China, the kind of global middle of the income distribution. The poor in rich countries have done quite badly. The very poor across the globe have not really done that well either. But the very rich have done really well. The global rich have done really well. So I still think that these deals fundamentally, what they should have instead of intellectual property, extending intellectual property rights, is they should extend labor standards, right? They should have provisions that enforce certain labor standards across the globe, and therefore whatever good they're doing will be massively enhanced. And I also think that one problem in richer countries, which is maybe more of a problem of domestic governance than it is of the trade deals, is that they should take care of these workers, right? I mean, I think globalization is here to stay. I do think that it's not, we're not going to bring back all the manufacturing that was lost in the UK and USA over the course of globalization. You can't magic these things out of thin air, but take care of the communities, take care of the workers. And that's something that countries in Northern Europe, for instance, actually do a bit better than in Anglosphere countries like the US and UK. So yeah, I think we just need to learn to manage globalization so that the interests of the poor are protected. And if we don't, we just see massive political backlash. And that's what we've had. We've had that with Brexit and Trump, who've explicitly, both of those things have targeted globalization and its fallout. I would like to think so. I mean, I think we do. We are. There's this saying, right, which is, I think, was coined by Rosa Luxemburg, which is socialism or barbarism. And I do think we're reaching ahead with a lot of what is happening in the USA, especially. I think you're seeing the decline of US hegemony, almost entirely self-inflicted as well, right? You're seeing, I think you've seen the rise of China as a big player, but we're moving towards a kind of a multipolar world, right? And even the EU, for instance, might move away from the USA. You're seeing this intensification of inequality. You're seeing the cutting off of aid to countries that really, really need it. And you're seeing, I think, a move towards oligarchy. The wealth of the tech billionaires jumped by unfathomable amounts when Trump was elected for a second time. Maybe 100 billion for Elon Musk, and not too far behind for maybe Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and so on. They're wealthy, and we're going to see the first trillionaire soon. And the on top of that, they're in the government, right? They're in the government. They own the media. It really does look like an oligarchy. So my worry is that you see an entrenchment of that status quo, and you get this kind of highly corrupt crony form of capitalism. Yanis Varoufakis has called it techno-feudalism, right? Where they're the lords or the monarchs, and everybody has to pay fealty to them, which is it's not a bad way of characterizing it. I do think that it's still capitalism. It's just a really highly intensified, corrupt form of it. But on the other hand, you have the EU, and you have China, which are presenting very different forms of capitalism different forms to each other as well. The EU is obviously more kind of social democratic, a bit of a smaller economy, more leisure time, slightly lower GDP, right? So less of a focus on the economy, less of a focus on the military historically. And with China, you've got this high growth, state-led form of capitalism. Are we going to see the EU and China move towards something beyond capitalism that is actually beneficial? It's all very much up in the air. But to answer your question directly, I do think we're seeing a shift away from the form of capitalism that's been in place since the 80s, since Thatcher and Reagan, sorry, everywhere. We're seeing a shift away from it. Now, whether that's more like socialism or more like barbarism depends on the area of the world that you're in, and it very much depends on how things develop. I think that clearly declining birth rates is a problem in a lot of richer countries. And it's well known that very poor countries have very high birth rates. There's a lot of economic research on this, and it's kind of depressing that basically part of the reason for high birth rates was historically because a lot of children would die. Even though infant mortality has fallen a lot, a lot of children acts as a kind of insurance for people in their old age. It's an economic imperative, and therefore, once incomes go up, once health improves, then parents don't need to have as many children, and therefore that goes down. Now, that's something that I think is, you're not going to change that. I think that's very much a sensible response to changes in the economy. And it's a good thing, obviously, that infant mortality has declined. But this really quite recent phenomenon that we have in, South Korea, we've got it in the UK as well, where we're maybe falling below the replacement rate. So like you usually want maybe 2.1, 2.2 children per couple to replace the population at least, and we're kind of falling below that, and we're kind of at it, near it, below it, and that's not a good thing, because obviously, we take that to an extreme, then you have no young people, right? But even not at an extreme, you have an aging population, and typically older people don't work, and for good reason, and so the younger population needs to support them, and that's a genuine economic challenge that we have. It's a real economic challenge. So I would say that things like the cost of living that I identify in the book. I don't talk about population, by the way, in the book, but it's a really valid inference. It's an interesting debate to have based on this getting poorer idea. The cost of living, you mentioned house prices, right? That takes away from people's ability to make ends meet. For a start, you've got a lot of couples where both people work now, right? And they kind of need to work to make ends meet. So you have the entry of women into the workforce, which is, I think, morally speaking, politically speaking, a good thing. But the economic consequence of this is that now both people need to work to pay for the house, to pay for the cost of living, and therefore there's nobody taking care of the child. So what do you need? You need childcare, right? But that's really, really expensive as well in most places. It's ridiculously expensive. So I think that is a big factor, both the cost of living and the cost of childcare specifically. I think if you address these things, you do give people more room to settle down. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? Where I'm from in the UK, people are having kids later. And people are buying houses later. People are getting married later. People are doing all of these things later. And a big part of the reason for that is just the cost of doing them is so high. And you have to reach a later stage of your career where you're both earning quite a lot before you can actually do it. So yeah, absolutely. It's that understanding economics and applying economic policy and talking about the economy, I think, is often associated with this idea of like tough love. What's good for the economy isn't good for the people. We've got to appease the economy like it's some kind of god. We've got to cut things. We've got to make the budget balance. I'm not saying there aren't genuine challenges in economics. We just talked about the aging population. I think that's a real genuine challenge. Climate change is another. I identify a lot of genuine challenges in the book. But there are many, many cases where doing what's good for people is good for the economy. If you think about things like health and education, having a healthy, educated workforce is really good for the economy. And we've seen this in the UK because we've had so much austerity that, schools and hospitals are literally collapsing, like the buildings are collapsing, right? And that's That's not good for an economy. If the kids can't go to school, if you can't treat the patients, if someone dies or they have ill health, therefore they're not working. These things are terrible for the economy. And there's plenty of evidence showing that these programs, they do have beneficial effects. Economically as well as beneficial effects for the people receiving them. So that is the primary takeaway. What's good for the people is often good for the economy.